There are places in the ocean where light cannot reach, where the pressure would crush a human body into pulp, where creatures live that have never seen the sun and never will. The deepest trenches, the darkest abysses, the cold, black water that extends miles below the surface. This is where the sea people lived. Not mermaids from children's stories with seashell bikinis and cheerful songs, but something older, stranger, more terrible. Beings that were human, above the waist, and fish below, adapted to survive in crushing depths, in freezing darkness, in a world utterly alien to the surface. They could not breathe air. They could not walk on land. They could not survive in the bright, warm, shallow waters where humans swam. They belonged to the deep, and the deep claimed them absolutely. But sometimes one of them would look up at the distant shimmer of sunlight filtering down from far above, would wonder what existed in that bright, impossible world, would dream of a life beyond the crushing darkness. This is the story of one such creature, a young sea woman who became obsessed with the surface world, who sacrificed everything for a chance to walk on land, who endured agony beyond measure for love that was never returned. This is the true story of the Little Mermaid, not the tale of true love and happy endings, but the story Hans Christian Andersen wrote in 1837, before it was sweetened and sanitized, the story of a creature who mutilated herself for a human, who never knew her name, who walked on knives for a man who married someone else, who was given a choice between murder and death, and chose to dissolve into foam on the ocean waves. This is a story about obsession and sacrifice, about the terrible price of changing your fundamental nature, about how love can destroy you when it's given to someone who cannot love you back. This is the horror of the Little Mermaid. In the deepest part of the ocean, far below where ships sailed and whales swam, there stood a palace of coral and pearl. The palace belonged to the Sea King, an ancient creature who ruled over all the beings of the deep. He had been widowed many years before, and his 6 daughters were raised by his mother, a stern old sea woman who wore a string of oysters in her hair to mark her rank. The 6 daughters were each born a year apart, and as they aged, they were granted privileges according to their seniority. On her 15th birthday, each princess was allowed to swim to the surface and see the world above the water for the first time. The 5 older sisters had already taken this journey and returned with stories of ships and cities, of stars and sunsets, of a world so different from the crushing darkness of the deep that it seemed like a dream. But the youngest daughter, who had no name in the human sense, but was called simply the Little One, was still only 14. She had 1 more year to wait before she could see the surface, and that year was torture. She spent her days in the palace garden, tending to the strange plants that grew in the lightless deep, bioluminescent anemones that glowed with cold blue light, tube worms that extended from volcanic vents, filtering nutrients from the boiling water, giant kelp that had drifted down from far above and somehow survived in the pressure and cold. In the center of her garden, the Little One had placed a marble statue she'd found in the wreckage of a sunken ship. It was a statue of a young man, carved in white stone, perfectly preserved by the cold water. She dragged it from the wreck to her garden and cleaned away the barnacles and sediment until the stone gleamed. She would sit beside the statue for hours, running her webbed fingers over its cold surface, imagining what the surface world must be like. Her sisters had described sunshine and how it felt warm on your skin. They'd talked about air and how it was lighter than water, how you could move through it easily. They'd mentioned humans and how strange they looked with their 2 legs and their feet and their inability to breathe underwater. The little one was obsessed with these stories. She questioned her sisters endlessly, demanding every detail about the surface. What did flowers smell like? How did birds fly? What were the stars? And why did they shine? Her sisters grew tired of her questions and would swim away, leaving her alone with her marble statue and her desperate longing for a world she couldn't yet see. Her grandmother watched this obsession with growing concern. "The surface world is not for us," the old sea woman said. "We belong to the deep. Our bodies are made for pressure and darkness and cold. Humans belong to air and light and warmth. The 2 worlds cannot mix." But my sisters visited the surface and returned safely, the little one argued. They visited, yes. They looked, but did not touch. They observed, but did not interact. That is the difference. Looking at the surface world is curiosity. Wanting to join it is madness. She collected every object that fell from the surface world, pieces of ships, fragments of cargo, items thrown overboard. She built a collection of human artifacts in her garden, arranging them around the marble statue like offerings to a god. She found books in waterproof containers and tried to decipher the strange symbols. Not knowing they were written in languages she couldn't possibly understand, she found clothing and held it against her scaled tail, wondering what it would feel like to wear such things. She found a mirror and stared at her own reflection, at her large eyes adapted for darkness, at her sharp teeth meant for tearing fish, at her pale skin that had never seen sunlight, and she wondered if humans would find her beautiful or monstrous. The night before her 15th birthday, the little one couldn't sleep. She swam through the palace halls, past her sleeping sisters, out into the dark ocean beyond. The water around the palace was so deep that even the bioluminescent creatures were sparse. The darkness was nearly absolute, the pressure immense, the cold intense enough to kill any surface creature instantly. But this was home to the sea people. This crushing darkness was where they thrived. The little one swam upward, rising through the water column, watching as the pressure decreased and the temperature gradually warmed. She passed through layers of the ocean marked by different creatures: the twilight zone where giant squid hunted, the midnight zone where anglerfish lurked with their glowing lures, the abyssal zone where the water was cold but not freezing, dark but not absolute. She stopped when she reached the thermocline, the boundary between the deep cold water and the warmer surface currents. This was as high as sea people usually ventured. Above this point, the water was too warm, too bright, too different from their natural habitat. But tomorrow she would cross this boundary. Tomorrow she would see the surface. She returned to the palace and lay in her bed of soft seaweed, counting the hours until dawn. Her grandmother came to her room and sat beside her. "You're excited," the old woman said, "but I need you to understand something. The surface world will seem beautiful and wonderful when you first see it, but it is not our world. We cannot live there. We cannot live there. We can only visit, and even that is dangerous. Promise me you'll remember that. I promise." The little one said, and at that moment, she meant it. But promises made in the darkness before a dream comes true are easy to break when the dream is finally within reach. The next morning, as the sun rose above the ocean far above, the little one began her ascent. Her sisters and grandmother gathered to wish her well. Her father, the Sea King, gave her his blessing and a pearl necklace to mark her coming of age. She swam upward through the familiar depths, through the zones she'd visited the night before, past the thermocline into warm water that felt strange against her cold, adapted skin. The water grew brighter as she rose, the darkness giving way to blue, then lighter blue, then a shimmer of silver that marked the surface. She broke through the waves into air for the first time in her life. The sensation was overwhelming. Air was so light, so thin, so strange. She couldn't breathe it, had to keep her gills submerged, but her head and shoulders were above water and she could see. The sky stretched endlessly above her, vast and blue and scattered with white clouds. The sun hung like a ball of fire, impossibly bright, warming her face with its light. The air had a smell, salt and wind, and something green she'd later learn was the scent of land. And in the distance, she saw the coast, buildings of stone and wood rising from the earth, smoke from chimneys. The movement of tiny figures she knew were humans. Beyond the buildings, green hills and forests and mountains reaching toward. The sky, it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She floated there for hours, just looking, absorbing every detail. Ships passed in the distance, their white sails catching the wind. Seabirds flew overhead, calling out in harsh voices. The sun moved across the sky, changing the color of the light from bright white to golden to orange as it approached the horizon. As evening fell, the little one noticed a large ship approaching. It was a magnificent vessel, 3-masted and beautifully decorated. Flags and banners flew from its rigging. Music and laughter drifted across the water. People moved on the deck, dressed in fine clothes, celebrating something. She swam closer, staying low in the water, just her eyes above the surface. The ship passed within 50 feet of her, close enough to see the people clearly, and there, standing on the deck, was the most handsome young man she'd ever seen. He was tall and well-built, with dark hair and strong features. He wore fine clothes and moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. The other people on the ship seemed to defer to him, bowing slightly when they addressed him. He was clearly someone important. The little one watched him with an intensity that transcended mere attraction. Something about this human called to her in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just his appearance, though he was handsome. It was something else. Something in the way he carried himself, the way he interacted with others, the way he looked out at the ocean as if he understood its vastness. She followed the ship as it sailed along the coast, staying far enough back that no one would notice her. The celebration continued as night fell. Lanterns were lit on the deck, casting warm, golden light across the water. Music played, a sound unlike anything in the deep ocean, rhythmic and melodic and joyful. The little one floated in the dark water, watching the bright ship, focusing on the young man she'd already decided she loved. Then the weather changed. Dark clouds rolled in from the horizon, moving fast, blocking out the stars. The wind picked up, whipping the waves into white caps. The ship's crew began to move with purpose, taking down sails, securing lines, preparing for a storm. The little one had seen storms from below, had felt the turbulence they created in the upper layers of the ocean. But she'd never seen one from the surface, never witnessed the full violence of wind and rain and lightning. The storm hit with terrifying force. Rain poured from the sky in sheets. Lightning split the darkness, followed by thunder that shook the air. Waves rose higher and higher, crashing over the ship's deck, tearing at the rigging. The ship tried to run before the storm, but the wind was too strong. A massive wave caught the vessel broadside and pushed it over. The masts hit the water. The hull rolled. People were thrown into the sea, screaming, struggling in the violent waves. The little one dove under a wave and swam toward the capsizing ship. She could see people drowning, their bodies pulled down by the weight of their wet clothes, their lungs filling with water. She couldn't save them all. There were too many, but she could try to save one. She found him in the chaos. The young man, unconscious, sinking into the dark water. She grabbed him and pulled him up, breaking the surface, keeping his head above water. He didn't breathe. His lips were blue, his skin pale. She swam with him toward the coast, fighting the waves, holding him close to her body. The storm raged around them, but she didn't stop. She pulled him through the violent water until she felt sand beneath her tail, until the waves were shallow enough to roll him onto the beach. She dragged him above the tide line and laid him on his back. Water poured from his mouth. She pressed on his chest the way she'd seen her sisters do with drowned fish they wanted to revive. Water came up, then air went in, and the young man coughed and gasped and lived. The little one sat beside him in the shallow water, her tail still in the waves, watching him breathe. He was unconscious, but alive. She'd saved him. As dawn approached, she heard voices. People were coming down the beach, searching for survivors from the wreck. She couldn't let them see her, couldn't let humans know that sea people existed. She slipped back into the water and swam a short distance away, hiding behind a rock formation where she could watch without being seen. A group of people found the young man. Among them was a young woman who knelt beside him and called for help. Others came running. They lifted him carefully and carried him away from the beach toward the buildings in the distance. The young man never opened his eyes, never saw who had saved him, never knew that a creature from the deep had loved him from the moment she first saw him and had risked everything to pull him from the drowning sea. The little one watched them take him away, and something broke inside her chest, a pain she'd never felt before, sharp and terrible and consuming. She loved this human with an intensity that defied reason. She'd saved his life. She belonged with him, but she was a creature of the deep and he was a being of the surface. There was no way for them to be together unless she changed, unless she became human herself. The thought took root in her mind like a poisonous seed. There were stories, ancient tales, of sea witches who could perform transformations. Magic that could change a fishtail into human legs. Power that could make the impossible real. But such magic always came with a price. The little one swam back to the deep, descending through the warm surface waters, through the thermocline, down into the crushing darkness of her home. But the palace that had once seemed beautiful now felt like a prison. The gardens that had once given her joy now meant nothing. All she could think about was the surface, the young man, the life she wanted and couldn't have. Her sisters noticed the change in her immediately. "Tell us about the surface," they cried. "What did you see? What was it like?" But the little one couldn't find words to describe what she'd experienced. The beauty of the sky, the warmth of the sun, the sight of a human she loved being carried away by people who would care for him while she had to return to the dark. "It was wonderful," she said quietly. "More wonderful than I ever imagined." Her grandmother looked at her with knowing eyes. "And now you want to go back?" "Yes." "And you want to stay there?" "Yes." "And you've fallen in love with a human?" The little one met her grandmother's gaze. "Yes." The old sea woman closed her eyes in pain. "Then you're already lost. Because love for a human is the one thing a sea person cannot survive. Our worlds are too different. Our natures are too opposed. You might as well fall in love with the sun itself. It will destroy you just as surely." "I don't care. I want to be with him. You don't even know his name. I'll learn it. I'll learn everything about him. I'll find a way to be with him." Her grandmother swam close and took the little one's face in her webbed hands. "Listen to me carefully. There is a sea witch who lives in the darkest part of the ocean, beyond the volcanic vents, in a place where the water is so toxic that nothing else can survive. She has power, ancient power, power to change forms and grant wishes. But she is evil and cruel, and her prices are terrible. If you go to her, you will pay more than you can imagine. I don't care about the price. I'll pay anything to be with him." That's what they all say, and that's how she destroys them. But the little one had already made her decision. That night, while her family slept, she slipped out of the palace and swam toward the darkest part of the ocean, toward the place where the sea witch lived. She swam past the familiar territories, past the volcanic vents where tube worms clustered, past the hydrothermal fields where strange bacteria thrived in boiling water. She descended deeper than she'd ever gone before, into water so cold and dark and dead that even bioluminescent creatures were absent. Finally, she reached the witch's domain. It was a forest of polyps, pale white organisms that grew from the ocean floor like grotesque flowers. They pulsed and writhed in the current, and as the little one swam between them, they reached out with their tendrils, as if trying to grab her. In the center of this forest was a cave, and from the cave emanated a green glow that was not natural light, but something else, something wrong. The little one swam into the cave. The sea witch sat on a throne made of the bones of creatures that had died in these toxic waters. She was enormous, twice the size of a normal sea person, with a tail that was thick and powerful and covered in scales that looked like armor. Her torso was human-like, but withered and ancient. Her face was beautiful in a terrible way, ageless and knowing and cruel. Around her swam her pets, eels with needled teeth, anglerfish with glowing lures, creatures from the deepest trenches that had no eyes, no color, just teeth and hunger. A visitor, the witch said, her voice like grinding stones. How delightful! It's been so long since anyone was foolish enough to seek me out. I need your help, the little one said, trying to keep her voice steady. Of course you do. No one comes here for pleasure. What is it you want? Power? Revenge? Knowledge? I want to be human. The witch's smile widened, showing teeth that were sharp and numerous. Ah, love then. You've fallen for a surface dweller. How predictable. Can you do it? Can you make me human? I can. I can split your tail into legs, change your scales to skin, make you breathe air instead of water. I can transform you so completely that even you won't recognize what you've become. Then do it, please. I'll pay whatever you ask. The witch leaned forward on her throne of bones. Because the price is steep, little one, and once paid, it can never be refunded. Tell me the price. First, your voice. I'll take your tongue, cut it out at the root, and you'll never speak again. You'll be mute in the human world, unable to tell anyone your story, unable to call for help, unable to express anything except through gestures and expressions. Her voice was one of the few things that made her beautiful. Her singing voice was the finest in her father's kingdom. But what did that matter if she couldn't be with the one she loved? I accept, she said. Second, the witch continued, the transformation will be agony. When I split your tail into legs, it will feel like a sword, cutting through your body from the inside. And once you have legs, every step you take will feel like walking on broken glass, like knives stabbing into the soles of your feet. This pain will never diminish. Every single step for the rest of your life will be torture. The little one's courage faltered. Every step, forever, forever. And you'll have to smile through it, have to act as if you feel no pain. Because if the humans see you suffering, they'll think you're damaged or diseased, and they'll cast you out. Is there no way to reduce the pain? None. That is the price of human legs for a creature born with a tail. Your body will never truly be human, only transformed to appear so. The pain is your reminder of what you really are. The little one thought about the young man on the beach, about his face, about the way she'd felt when she saved him. Was he worth this price? Was any human worth eternal agony? I accept, she heard herself say. Third, the witch said, her smile growing even wider, you must understand what happens if you fail to win his love. If the human marries another, if he pledges himself to someone else, you will die. On the morning after his wedding, you will dissolve into foam on the ocean waves. You will cease to exist. No afterlife, no reunion with your family in the deep, no peace, just nothing. But if he loves me, if he chooses me, then you'll live as a human for the rest of your mortal days. You'll age and die as they do. And when you die, because you were not born human, you will not have a soul. You will not go to whatever afterlife humans believe in. You will simply end, but at least you'll have had a life with him. The little one processed this information. Die if he marries another. Live without a soul if he chooses her. There was no good outcome here, no happy ending, only different kinds of loss. Why are you doing this? She asked the witch. What do you gain from transforming me? The witch laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Entertainment. I'm bored in these toxic waters, alone with my pets and my power. Watching you suffer will amuse me. Watching you try to win a human who doesn't know you exist, while walking on knives and unable to speak, while knowing that failure means dissolution into foam. It will be the finest tragedy I've witnessed in centuries. You're evil. I'm honest. The evil is in what you're choosing to do to yourself. I'm merely providing the means. The little one knew she should swim away, should return to her family, should forget the human, and accept her life in the deep. Everything about this deal was wrong. The price was too high. The outcome was doomed. But the image of the young man's face filled her mind. The memory of his skin against hers as she pulled him from the drowning waves. The desperate, irrational love that had consumed her from the moment she first saw him. I accept all your terms, she said. Transform me. The witch rose from her throne, towering over the little one. Very well. Come here, little fool. Let me take what's mine before I give you what you think you want. The little one swam forward. The witch grabbed her head with both hands, forced her mouth open, and reached inside. Her fingers found the little one's tongue, gripped it at the root, and tore. The pain was beyond description. The little one tried to scream but couldn't. The witch's hand blocked her throat. She tried to pull away, but the witch's grip was iron. Blood filled her mouth, spilled into the water around them, attracting the witch's pets who circled hungrily. The witch pulled out the severed tongue and held it up, examining it. Beautiful. This will make a fine addition to my collection. She released the little one who clutched at her throat, gagging on blood, trying desperately not to drown in her own body's fluids. The witch swam to a shelf carved into the cave wall where jars floated, each one containing a tongue preserved in some kind of fluid. She added the little one's tongue to the collection. Now for the transformation, the witch said. She began to speak words in a language older than the ocean itself. Her hands moved in complex patterns, leaving trails of green light in the water. The magic took hold of the little one's body and started to change it. First, she felt her scales loosening, falling away from her skin like autumn leaves. Her pale flesh beneath was soft and vulnerable, no longer protected by the armor she'd been born with. Then her tail began to split. The pain was exactly as the witch had promised. It felt like a sword cutting through her from the inside, starting at the base of her spine and working downward. Her single tail was being divided into two legs, bones forming where there had been none, muscles and tendons creating themselves in a process that violated every law of nature. She tried to scream but had no voice. She tried to swim away, but her body wouldn't respond. She could only float in the toxic water, feeling herself be unmade and remade, feeling her fundamental nature being destroyed and replaced with something foreign and wrong. Her gills sealed shut. Her fins dissolved. Her webbed hands separated into individual fingers. Her large eyes, adapted for darkness, became smaller, more vulnerable to light. Her body temperature rose to match human blood instead of cold ocean water. The transformation took hours or maybe minutes. The little one lost track of time, lost track of everything except the agony of being rebuilt into a shape she was never meant to have. Finally, it was done. She hung in the water, no longer able to breathe through gills, her new lungs burning for air she didn't have. The witch grabbed her and propelled her upward, pushing her through the ocean at impossible speed, rising through the depths toward the surface. They broke through the waves, and the little one gasped, drawing air into her lungs for the first time. It felt strange and insufficient, like she was suffocating even while breathing. Her new human body shivered in the air, cold without the protection of the deep water. The witch released her near the same beach where the little one had left the young man days before. There you are, little fool. Human legs, human body, mute tongue, eternal pain. Everything you asked for. Enjoy your new life. I'll be watching from the deep, waiting to see how long it takes before you regret this choice. The witch dove beneath the waves and was gone. The little one tried to swim, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She had no tail, no fins, nothing to propel her through the water. Her legs kicked awkwardly, her arms flailed, and she barely managed to keep her head above the waves. The current pushed her toward shore. Waves rolled her onto the sand. She lay there gasping, trying to understand this new body, these new sensations. She tried to stand. The moment she put weight on her feet, the pain hit her like a hammer. The witch had not lied. It felt exactly like walking on broken glass, like knives stabbing into her soles with every slight movement. She fell back onto the sand, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't speak to cry out, couldn't call for help, could only lie there in silent agony, feeling the knives in her feet, the wrongness of her human body, the terrible price she paid for a love that might never be returned. As dawn broke, she heard voices approaching, people coming down to the beach. She looked down at herself and realized she was naked, her human body exposed. She had no clothes, no covering, nothing. A group of people appeared on the beach. Among them was the young woman who'd been there when the little one had rescued the man from the shipwreck. The woman saw her and called out in alarm. People rushed over. They wrapped a blanket around the little one's naked body. They asked her questions she couldn't answer. Who was she? Where had she come from? Was she a survivor from another shipwreck? She could only shake her head, unable to speak, unable to explain. They helped her to her feet, and the pain of standing made her sway. Someone caught her, concerned. Are you injured? Can you walk? She forced herself to smile, to hide the agony, and took a step. The knives stabbed into her feet. She took another step, more knives. But she kept smiling, kept walking, even as every movement was torture. They brought her to the palace, because of course the young man she loved was a prince. Of course he lived in wealth and power, surrounded by servants and advisors living a life she could never truly join. The prince wasn't there when they arrived. He was away in the city, attending to royal duties. But the servants were kind to the little one. They gave her clothes, fed her food she could barely swallow with her ruined throat, showed her to a small room where she could rest. She lay in the bed, feeling the softness of fabric against her transformed skin, feeling the constant ache of her mutilated tongue, feeling the phantom pain of her missing tail. This was her new existence, pain and silence, and waiting for a man who didn't know she existed. The little one was in the garden when she saw him approaching. Her heart, her new human heart, began to pound. This was him, the man she'd saved, the man she loved. She stood despite the knives in her feet and moved toward him. He looked at her with mild curiosity, taking in her unusual appearance, her obvious inability to speak. "Who is this?" he asked the servant, walking beside him. "A girl we found on the beach, Your Highness. She appears to be mute. We don't know where she came from." The prince stepped closer to the little one, examining her face. She looked into his eyes and silently begged him to recognize her, to remember, to know that she was the one who had saved him, but there was no recognition in his gaze, only polite interest. "She's quite beautiful in an unusual way. Can she hear?" The little one nodded frantically. "But you cannot speak." She shook her head, feeling tears threatening. He didn't know her, didn't recognize her. The person who had pulled him from the sea was invisible to him. "Well, you're welcome to stay at the palace," the prince said kindly. "Any survivor of the sea has our hospitality." He smiled at her, a warm but impersonal smile, and walked past her into the palace. The little one stood in the garden, tears streaming down her face, feeling the knives in her feet, tasting blood from her mutilated tongue, knowing that the man she loved saw her as nothing more than a curiosity, a mute girl found on the beach. The months that followed were a special kind of hell. The little one lived in the palace as a sort of companion to the prince, though he never understood who or what she really was. He enjoyed her company because she couldn't talk, couldn't interrupt his thoughts, or bore him with meaningless chatter. He would take her on walks through the gardens and talk about his life, his responsibilities, his dreams, never expecting a response. She would walk beside him, smiling through the agony of every step, listening to him speak about a world she could never truly join, loving him with an intensity that grew more desperate with each passing day. He told her about the shipwreck, about how he'd nearly drowned, about waking up on the beach to see a beautiful young woman kneeling beside him. "She saved my life," he said. "I only saw her for a moment before I lost consciousness again, but I'll never forget her face. I've been searching for her ever since." The little one wanted to scream. She wanted to grab him and shake him and force him to understand that she was the one who saved him, that she had pulled him from the drowning waves, that she had given up everything to be with him, but she had no voice, no way to communicate the truth. She could only listen as he described the young woman from the beach, described someone else, someone who wasn't her. The reality was that the prince had never seen the little one save him. He'd been unconscious when she pulled him from the water. The first face he saw upon waking was the young woman who'd found him on the beach, and he'd assumed she was his rescuer. The little one tried to tell him through gestures, through expressions, through desperate miming, but the prince didn't understand. He thought she was playing some kind of game, acting out a story to amuse him. He would laugh and pat her head like a child and go back to talking about his search for the woman he believed had saved his life. Every night, the little one would return to her room and weep silently into her pillow. Her feet would throb with constant pain from the day's walking. Her throat would ache where her tongue had been cut out. Her chest would hurt with a different kind of pain, the pain of loving someone who would never love her back. She began to understand what the sea witch had meant about entertainment. This was torture more refined than any physical suffering. The witch was watching from the deep, laughing at the little one's silent agony, amused by the tragedy unfolding exactly as predicted. 6 months after the transformation, the prince announced he was going to visit a neighboring kingdom. There was a princess there, he explained, daughter of the king and queen who ruled the coastal realm. The two kingdoms had been allies for generations, and there was talk of a marriage alliance. I don't love her, the prince told the little one as they walked through the gardens. One last time before his journey. I've never even met her. If this marriage will bring peace and prosperity, then I'll do what's required of me. He looked sad as he said this, and the little one felt a surge of hope. He didn't want this marriage. He was being forced into it by responsibility. Maybe there was still a chance, still a possibility, but he might choose her instead. The prince asked her to accompany him on the journey. "You've become a dear friend," he said. "Your presence comforts me. Keep me company during the voyage." The little one nodded, though. The thought of watching him meet another woman made her want to dissolve into foam right there in the garden. They boarded a ship and sailed along the coast toward the neighboring kingdom. The little one stood at the rail, looking down at the dark water, wondering if her family knew what had happened to her. Her sisters, her grandmother, her father, the Sea King, did they mourn her loss? Or had they known from the beginning that she was doomed? The voyage took 3 days. On the final afternoon, as they approached the harbor of the neighboring kingdom, the prince stood beside the little one at the rail and pointed toward the palace on the shore. "There it is, my future whether I want it or not." The little one looked at the palace, at the flags flying from its towers, and felt a cold dread settling in her chest. They docked in the harbor and were greeted by representatives of the royal family. The prince and his companions were escorted to the palace with great ceremony. The little one walked behind him, every step an agony of knives, every breath a struggle against a pain in her ruined throat. In the throne room, the king and queen waited to greet them, and beside them stood a young woman in an elaborate gown, her hair arranged in an ornate style, her face painted with makeup. The prince bowed to the king and queen, then turned his attention to the princess. She curtsied gracefully, and when she raised her head, the prince's face transformed. His eyes widened, his breath caught. He stepped forward, reaching out as if to touch her face, then stopping himself. "It's you," he whispered. "You're the one from the beach, the one who saved me." The princess smiled, clearly confused. "I'm sorry, Your Highness, but we've never met before. After the shipwreck, I woke on the beach and saw your face above me. I've been searching for you ever since." The little one felt the world collapsing around her. The princess from this kingdom looked remarkably similar to the young woman who had found the prince on the beach, similar enough that in his confused state, after nearly drowning, the prince had merged the two memories together, creating a false recollection of this princess as his savior. The princess, not understanding but delighted by the prince's obvious attraction, played along. Perhaps it was fate that brought you here then. Perhaps we were meant to meet. The prince fell to one knee. Then let our kingdoms be joined. If your father agrees, I would be honored to make you my wife. The king, pleased by this enthusiastic acceptance of the arranged marriage, gave his blessing immediately. The queen called for wine and celebration. And just like that, the little one's last hope shattered into pieces. She stood at the back of the throne room, tears streaming down her face, watching the prince embrace a woman who had never saved him, had never pulled him from the drowning waves, had never given up everything to be with him. The wedding was planned for 1 week later. The fastest royal wedding in the history of either kingdom, rushed by the prince's impatient love for a woman he believed had saved his life. During that week, the little one continued to serve as the prince's companion, now watching him with his betrothed, seeing them walk together in gardens, hearing him tell her stories about his near-death experience and her miraculous rescue of him. The princess, who was kind and gentle, befriended the little one. "You poor thing," she said, one afternoon as they sat in the garden. "You cannot speak, and yet I can see in your eyes that you have so much to say. I wish I could hear your story. I wish I could know where you came from and what brought you to my future husband's palace." The little one wanted to hate this princess, wanted to see her as an enemy, but she couldn't. The princess had done nothing wrong. She was simply there, simply resembling someone else, simply accepting a prince who loved her for things she didn't actually do. The real tragedy was not the princess. The real tragedy was a prince who loved a false memory and a mute girl who loved the real man but could never tell him the truth. On the night before the wedding, the little one walked down to the beach. She stood at the edge of the water, feeling the waves lap at her feet, the salt water stinging the cuts that walking had worn into her soles. The moon was full, reflecting on the dark ocean. She looked out at that vast expanse and thought about diving in, about swimming down to the deep, about returning to her family. Even though she could no longer breathe water, she would drown quickly. It would be painful, but brief. Better than dissolving into foam the morning after the prince's wedding. At least drowning would be an active choice rather than a passive dissolution. But even as she thought this, she couldn't bring herself to walk into the waves. Some part of her still hoped for a miracle, still believed that somehow, impossibly, things might change. She sat on the sand and wept silently, her shoulders shaking, her ruined throat aching with sobs that produced no sound. That's when her sisters appeared in the waves. They rose from the water, their faces pale and strained. Their beautiful hair, which they'd always worn long, had been cut short, cropped close to their heads. The little one stood and ran to the water's edge, ignoring the knives in her feet. She reached toward her sisters, desperate for their touch, for some connection to the family she'd lost. her oldest sister held up something that gleamed in the moonlight. A knife, its blade sharp and silver and deadly. "We went to the sea witch," her sister said, her voice carrying over the sound of the waves. "We gave her our hair, all of it, in exchange for this knife and a chance to save you." The little one took the knife, not understanding. "Before the sun rises tomorrow," her sister continued, "before the prince wakes beside his new wife, you must go to their chamber. You must plunge this knife into the prince's heart and let his blood spill on your feet. When his blood touches your legs, they will transform back into a tail. You will be able to return to the ocean, to come home, to be with us again." The little one stared at the knife in her hand, at its sharp edge, at the moonlight reflecting on its surface. "Kill him?" her sister urged. "He doesn't love you. He never will. He loves a false memory. He's marrying another woman. He's not worth your life. Kill him and save yourself." The sisters gave her one last desperate look, then sank beneath the waves, returning to the deep that had been their home and could be hers again if she would just commit one act of murder. The little one stood on the beach, holding the knife, feeling its weight, understanding the choice before her. Kill the man she loved and live, or let him live and dissolve into foam at dawn. She returned to the palace and made her way silently through the dark halls. She knew where the prince's chambers were, knew he was there now with his new bride, sleeping peacefully beside the woman he believed had saved his life. She stood outside the door, the knife in her hand. She could hear their breathing inside, soft and rhythmic. She could end this with one thrust of the blade, could feel his blood on her feet, could transform back into her true form and escape this nightmare of human existence. Her hand reached for the door handle, but she couldn't do it. Not because she was too weak, not because she was too kind, but because she loved him, truly loved him. And love meant wanting him to be happy. Even if his happiness destroyed her, he was happy with his princess bride. He believed she'd saved his life. He was content in his false memory. Why should the little one shatter that? Why should her suffering extend to him? What would she gain except the bitter satisfaction of revenge? She turned away from the door, walked down the hallway, through the palace, out to the beach, where she'd been transformed 6 months earlier. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east. Dawn was approaching. The wedding had taken place. The morning after was here. Her time was up. She walked into the waves, feeling the salt water on her transformed skin, remembering how it had felt when water was her natural home. She walked deeper until the water was at her waist, her chest, her neck. The sun broke over the horizon. The little one felt herself begin to dissolve. It didn't hurt. That was the surprising thing. After 6 months of constant pain, of knives in her feet with every step, of the ache of her mutilated throat, of the agony of unrequited love, the dissolution was almost gentle. She looked down and saw her hands becoming transparent, losing their solidity. She looked at the shore and saw the palace where the prince slept beside his bride. She thought about her family in the deep, about the marble statue in her garden, about all the dreams she'd had that would now never come true. The foam spread up her arms across her chest. She was becoming part of the sea, spray, part of the whitecaps on the waves, part of the morning mist rising from the ocean. Her last thought before consciousness faded was not of the prince, not of her family, but of the sea witch who had been right about everything, who had known from the beginning how this story would end, who was somewhere in the toxic depths, laughing at another tragic fool who had paid everything for love that was never returned. The little one dissolved completely into foam on the ocean waves. Her body dispersed into millions of tiny droplets, indistinguishable from the sea spray, gone as if she had never existed. There was no afterlife for her, no reunion with her family, no peace or rest. She had not been born human, so she had no soul to transcend. She simply ceased to be. The waves continued to crash on the shore. The sun rose higher in the sky. In the palace, the prince woke beside his wife and smiled happy in his false memory, never knowing the truth of who had saved him. The sea witch, far below in her cave of bones and toxic water, added a new jar to her collection. Inside it, preserved in fluid, was the little one's tongue, still perfect, still beautiful, still capable of producing the songs it would never sing again. And that was the end of The Little Mermaid. Not a story of true love conquering all, not a tale of transformation and happiness, but a story about obsession and sacrifice and the terrible price of trying to be something you're not. She loved a man who never knew her name. She walked on knives for months for someone who loved a false memory. She gave up her voice, her family, her world, her very existence for a chance at a love that was doomed from the start. The ocean has claimed her now, absorbed her back into itself, erased her as if she never was. The only evidence of her existence is a severed tongue in a jar and a marble statue in an abandoned garden in the deep, slowly being covered by sediment, slowly being forgotten. This is the true horror of The Little Mermaid, not the transformation, not the pain, but the meaninglessness of her sacrifice. She suffered and died for nothing. Her existence mattered to no one. She dissolved into foam and the world continued on without her, indifferent to her suffering, unmoved by her tragedy. And somewhere in the deep ocean, in the darkest waters, where light cannot reach, the sea witch smiles and waits for the next desperate fool who will trade everything for an impossible dream, because there will always be another. There will always be someone who loves what they cannot have, who sacrifices what they should keep, who walks on knives toward their own destruction. The ocean is deep and dark and full of tragic stories. The Little Mermaids is just one of countless tales of transformation and loss that the waves have swallowed and the foam has carried away. She is gone now, completely gone, as if she never existed at all. And that is the true horror. Not that she died, but that she died for nothing, that her love was wasted, that her sacrifice was meaningless, that she ceased to exist and the world didn't even notice. The foam on the waves looks the same as it did before. The ocean continues its eternal rhythm. The prince lives happily with his wife. The sea witch collects her trophies, and nothing changes. Nothing ever changes. The Little Mermaid dissolved into foam, and the world moved on without her. That is the end.